of the time before we turn it over to the actual discussion. So this session today is really exciting because the purpose of it is to hear from you all. Each year, one of the most important things to come out of the summit is a set of policy recommendations built by you all and used by the Internet Society for the rest of the year to set our agenda on what we'll work to accomplish alongside Indigenous communities and push forward with policymakers for the months to come. So we have 4 really exciting discussion leaders with us here today. We have Brandon Makawawa from the Nation of Hawaii, Ninial Simmons of the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. We're going to have Anna Higgins, a project coordinator at the Internet Society for Strong Internet, and also an alumni from last year's trainings, and Katie Jordan, who's a senior policy advisor here at the Internet Society. So how this is going to work is we're going to break out into 4 different discussion groups and separate breakout rooms, and we'll come up with about 4 or 5 policy recommendations each. So as we've been going through these sessions, we've kind of been having larger discussions about what better policy for Indigenous connectivity can look like. So this is the time to bring out those ideas, whatever recommendations you've been thinking of, and we'll brainstorm together. We'll talk it out. It's really informal. We can use the chat or just speak up however you please. And then each of those 4 groups will come up with 4 to 5 items, super high level, doesn't have to be really in depth yet, because we're going to use the rest of the week to hash out the details of these. And then for the rest of the week, like I said, we're going to sort of add a little bit of flair and detail to these. And as we go, keep editing. And then at the end, we're going to present on the last day and make sure that we're all on the same page with this set of recommendations and that we all agree that these are good, strong items to move forward with. So with that, why don't I let a few of our discussion leads introduce themselves. Do we have Brandon here with us just yet?
I don't think he's here yet, Sarah, and I don't think Niniao has made it yet either. So I just pinged her.
Okay. So while we're waiting for them, we can, I guess, just start with our own high-level discussion of what you guys have been thinking about and bringing up. And I can also, let me link for you the 2019 policy recommendations, because those will be really useful for us as we're thinking about what good recommendations look like. And these are fantastic because we actually had a lot of success with a few of these recommendations. And then I don't want to call out this anonymous user, but I noted a really great recommendation in one of our previous policy sessions that I'm just going to throw in the chat. And I also have it right here in my notes if we want to use, but this is a really good example of an idea that that we can use as a policy recommendation. Hang on one second. Okay. So if that was your recommendation, congratulations. I thought it was a great example of something that we can use to move forward with this document. And Katie, Anna, if you guys have anything to add while we wait for our discussion leads.
Yeah, so, I think one thing that might be good just while we're waiting is we can start this conversation as a group. Some of you have been in these conversations at Indigenous Connectivity Summits past, and you may have some ideas of the direction that we want to head in the future. But like Sarah said, I really want to emphasize that this should build off of what you have learned over the last 6 weeks, but it should also really build off of your own personal experience. So as a group, we have all come together to learn what it means to be an advocate for our communities. And now what we want to do is create a consensus-driven document on behalf of this group that says, with that knowledge, with the knowledge of what it means, but also who we are, we need to move forward in X way. And we would ask each of you that graduates from this program to take these policy recommendations to heart and to talk about them when you're able to, because in the same way the Internet Society for the next year is going to focus on these policy recommendations and make sure that we elevate them for policymakers in both the US and in Canada, and say, this is what the community wants you to do. And that's really, I think, an important and powerful thing. So what we could do maybe is, while we're waiting, we could ask for a few suggestions now. And this should be our most discussion driven session of the entire training. I really hope that you all will put some suggestions forward. And if you need some sort of inspiration, check out the recommendations from last year and we can sort of give you some info on how this has gone in the past. But I hope everyone has thought of lots of good ideas throughout the sessions. Maybe, Sarah, it'd be helpful if you want to share your screen with the policy recommendations so the group can see what that looks like.
It looks like we have Matt who wants to say something.
Oh, awesome.
Hey, Matt.
I'll break the ice. What the hell? So, hello, everyone. It's been a while. Let's see. So I just wanted to address Trevor's comment or suggestion. You know, it's based in Canada, it looks like, but it's been talked about here. I was part of a project with Obama's administration to identify the fiber assets in the United States, why they weren't getting to Indian reservations, what was the missing link. And we pulled out 8,000 missing middle mile connector miles from the backhaul drain or the long haul fiber into the reservation. So that is obviously a big obstacle to overcome to get fiber to each of the tribes in the lower 48 states, and you know, more complicated than Alaska as well. And then Hawaii becomes a whole different animal. But one of the things that we came up against repeatedly was that the individual assets are owned by companies who feel that the strategic placement of their equipment and their fiber and their assets is proprietary. So a lot of that was done under non-disclosure agreement, and it made it very complicated to be able to share that or get funding to support the project to be able to do a better job of it. The next piece that we ran into on that is Department of Homeland Security for the United States is very disinterested in publishing a tell-all of where the infrastructure of our communications are in the United States for fear that it is a national security risk. So there are groups out there that have just kind of said, well, we don't care if anybody sees our stuff. We're just going to put it on our website. Now it's, you know, desktop engineering, high level map. It's not detailed to, is it on that sidewalk or is it on that side of the street? But at least it gives you an understanding of where the assets are and where they live. I think maybe if we could approach it, you know, like Trevor said, but keep it at a higher level where you're not actually identifying the specific GPS marker in the ground where that fiber lives, but that Interstate 8 has 3 companies of fiber, 2 on the south and 1 on the north side of the road going down that, and here's those companies that have that fiber. I think maybe that still becomes an asset for everybody to understand who to contact and where the opportunity may lie. So that was just a couple cents there for you.
Yeah, that's really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's interesting you say that, because those are exactly the things that stakeholders would say in big private corporations. And they're all hurdles that we were able to get over. Oil and gas already, like here in Canada, they already publish all their assets. So everybody knows where to bomb them, and they have been bombed. So, I mean, it's possible. It's a question. I thought that's what policy's for, is for government to give direction to industry. So I thought that these were exactly salient policy points.
Yeah, they are. I think they just have to be done outside the normal channels to be able to get a result, because the channels that were pursued, obviously it started at the White House, that stepped out of government and became a private entity, but the relationships were those relationships with the network builders themselves, many under a non-disclosure agreement. You could take the marketing map of these organizations and, put a team together to lay that marketing map over Real Map or Google Earth or something, so that you had a sort of a full marketing picture of what that looks like. But what is marketing and what is reality are two different things. Marketing is also way behind reality. And so there's a balance, and it's an ever, it's an ever evolving living document. So it'd be something that we'd have to throw some energy at for sure.
What's the, I can't remember what it's called in the USA. Is it Competition Bureau? So isn't it anti-competitive essentially to keep your assets secret? Because that's essentially how they keep competitors out of the Canadian market, which is why our cell phone bills are so expensive.
I'm not sure who runs that, if it's FTC or who it is.
So when there's issues with getting stuff going forward, as a project manager, I'm always considering if the right stakeholders are at the table. So what I'm saying is I think there were stakeholders missing in
Well,
that discussion when it was at the White House.
I fully agree. We got the map done, but we just couldn't publish it. So yeah, the fact of that matter is you'd have to have somebody leaning on those corporations to be able to allow that to be public or generalized to the point where you could show all the networks overlaid in one color and you couldn't tell who was who. And I think that was something that was being pursued, and I think it just lost traction over time. And now it's several years old, so obviously it's changed.
In Canada, what we have right now is we have the CRTCs actually looking at an intervention that the First Mile Connectivity Consortium has put in. And that is the CRTC recognizes that this is a problem. And so the suggestion that First Mile is making is that there be an index of where all these assets are, the dark fiber assets, but there be provisions as to who can access the information. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it was something that Melanie Pilon did. She did in the training, the business of running a community network. She talked about the whole concept of ground truthing, which is a new term to me, but she actually hired a gentleman who had experience in this area, who was able to come into her region and actually find out where the dark fiber was. So that's another way to go at it.
Yeah. Sally, those are really good points, and Matt also, and the chat is, you guys are coming up with some really great ideas and discussion points already. But given the limited amount of time that we have, let's save these for our separate breakout rooms, because we do have Brandon here, one of our discussion leads. So we're going to separate in just a minute here, and then bring any ideas that you brought to the chat to those separate rooms, and any questions. Myron, I know I saw your hand. Sorry that we couldn't get to you in time, so be sure to bring up your point in your discussion room. So in just a minute here, we're going to break out, but if anyone has any last minute questions, I think we might have one more minute. Nope. Okay. So again, we're just going to use the time in our breakout rooms to draft some really high level recommendations. So while you guys can certainly dive into those details, because a lot of you are experts and have so much experience, what we really want to draw out is some really high level points that we can then add more substance to during the week. And I think we're just waiting on the breakout. So you'll see a little icon pop up on your screen, and all you have to do is click join the breakout room and you should be set.
Hello, everybody. How's it going so far today?
It's going.
Awesome. That's what I like to hear, that enthusiasm. Was everybody able to get their crimping kit working or their Ethernet working? Getting there? Okay, well, that's all right. I'm still far behind on mine, so we're all in it together. Good for you, Frank. That's awesome that yours is working. All right, cool. So I know we only have a short amount of time together, so I want to run through this fairly quickly. As I said, and as Sarah said and beforehand, what we're trying to do here is set some high-level policy recommendations for the upcoming year. And there's a link in the chat to last year's policy recommendations. But the kinds of things that we're looking for are really what you think could be accomplished in the next year to drive policy forward, both to make Indigenous communities better connected and also have more potentially control over that connection themselves and control over what kind of access they have. So in the past, we've done things like Indigenous communities should be consulted, should be not only consulted, but meaningfully engaged before there is any build on their land. Another thing that we've done is Indigenous creators should have control over the content that they create online, over what happens with that content. We've done things like Native Hawaiians must be included as a tribal nation under the FCC's definition. We've also had things around training, where if federal money is given to a private organization, such as a service provider or something like that, to deploy on Indigenous land, that private entity must train communities on the land to actually maintain the networks that are there, and they must be consulted about where that infrastructure goes. So there's a huge variety here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and, oh, actually, sorry, before I say this, we're going to need, when we go back into the full session, we'll need one person to give a high level overview of the kind of things we talked about. Does anyone want to volunteer to do that?
I'll do it, Katie.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay.
On the spot, since I'm one of the only people on video.
I know. I was worried I was going to have to call on either you or Joel for that exact reason. So thank you so much for volunteering. All right. So I will put the link to last year's recommendations in the chat again, just for reference. And then I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. This might get a little funky, actually. Okay. I hope that this works well. Can you guys see the policy recommendations right now? All right, cool. Then let's go here. Okay, so does anyone have an idea to get us started? Would it be helpful to look at last year's as a place to start?
Yeah, I think so.
In some ways, I feel like find it hard to move on beyond what we call the Holland Bill in the U.S. From representative from Mexico, and from that I would craft that tribes should have first access to spectrum over their lands, and I would even add, if in the event that any licenses are transferred, that they should be able to have first right of refusal. So you sort of have spectrum moving forward, but also an opportunity to pull back existing spectrum that's being used.
Chris, I love that idea. And that's actually something we've talked a lot about with last year's alumni of this training. They were actually very involved in the discussion around this bill with Rep. Holland's office, which was really exciting. And one thing that we wanted to say for this group too is that if this group decides that it wants to endorse a bill specifically, we can do that. But I highly recommend doing what Chris just did and saying the best part of this bill, or one of the best parts, is the issue of spectrum. And if we say, broadly speaking, this group recommends tribes having first access to spectrum and first right of refusal, then we can talk about that in both the US and in Canada. And if there's a potential administration shift in the US, we can take the overarching principle and push that in new ways, not just that one bill from Rep. Holland. So that's a great idea. And so maybe what we would say here is Indigenous communities, because in Canada, they're not necessarily called tribes.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Chris. Does anybody else have something they want to put forward?
I don't know if it's too vague, but there's something in the idea of separating the assets from the service, right? The ownership of the infrastructure itself is, I think it's a big problem because it leads to an enormous amount of redundancy, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that everybody hides that information so that there's perfectly good infrastructure that's not being utilized. But that's because the ownership of the infrastructure is in the hands of the service provider. But if the ownership was different, especially for Indigenous communities who, it answers autonomy and it answers that nationhood, that they own the infrastructure, but the service, it doesn't take anything away from the provider, because the real need for an internet service provider is the technical aspect of it, right? For the service and the flow of the internet itself. The backbone is just wires, right?
Absolutely. And I don't know if I've captured this exactly right, so let me know. But I think one of the things that this ties well with is the idea of community networks. And we've been, as the Internet Society, we've been really emphasizing the need for more inclusive policies for community networks for a long time for this exact reason. So I think that's a great idea. When you talk about this, do you mean sort of a community-owned network like a traditional community network, or that plus maybe some other model?
Well, and I think it doesn't restrict it. It supports one for sure, but it would allow you to choose. It doesn't mean that, at the end of the day, you may actually have an internet service provider who does the dig, who does the install, who maintains all of the switches and stuff, who does the day-to-day service with the end customer. They may, or any one of those parts could be done by any other number of ways, right? So, but I think the focus of it is owning the infrastructure gives you the keys to the kingdom, and you get to choose, and you can revoke that, right? The biggest thing about sovereignty is that you willingly go into an agreement knowing that you can leave that agreement at any time, right? So even if you bring in a service provider to do 5 out of the 5 things, somewhere down the line you can change that because you own it. When the provider comes in with everything and they own everything, if you make them mad, to pack up their ball and they go home, and then you have no service anymore. So you're kind of at their who owns the infrastructure has the keys, right? So it's flipping the idea that you own it and you can parse it out how you want to. If you want to run that internally in the community and you have the capacity, great. If you need to farm that out, great. It actually does provide for competition, because you own the wires, so you can let one or more or many providers fight for giving you that service. So it will actually drive costs, which in a rural environment, we all know does not happen right now, right? Because each individual provider owns the infrastructure. So it flips the script on control.
I think that's a great idea. And I'm trying to remember the exact wording we used last year, and this may have been in 2018, but there was a provision that we wanted to include where tribal communities or Indigenous communities more broadly, here we go, or that's the spectrum one. But essentially, if a federal agency was going to create an opportunity for investment in infrastructure, it needed to specifically write that language in a way that was inclusive of small, new, rural, and Indigenous networks. Because as it is right now, a lot of the money that goes towards new infrastructure is really tailored towards the largest providers, which sort of by default excludes community networks. So maybe what I can do is find that language and see if it makes sense this year as well.
We we just had in Manitoba, we just had the opposite happen. We had money allocated for community, First Nation directed community money for these networks. And there was some infighting and it was taken away and rewritten. And the RFP went out to exclude anyone basically that wasn't a telecommunications company. So it's very specifically not just not happening here, but going the other way.
I totally agree. We've had a similar situation in the US, especially around things like the RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which was supposed to be this huge and wonderful thing for rural areas. And by default, it excluded new and rural and Indigenous providers. So it's incredibly frustrating. And I think it's a great idea to keep pushing for this, especially because, you know, last year, and I should say, this is a note for the whole group, but last year we had about 15 graduates of this program, of this training program, most of whom are now actively working with us and who we work really hard to include in our conversations with policymakers. This year, we had over 180 registrants of this group, and we're on track to graduate between, I hope we'll have about 50 to 60 graduates this year. So this group is exponentially growing, and we are creating, I hope, a network of people dedicated to really pushing this forward and pushing forward the importance of this. So I hope that there are some things that carry over year for year and we can say, this continues to be a problem and there is a growing movement calling on you policymakers to fix it. So I like that a lot. And to that point too, one thing that we've had in here every year, and we don't have to include it this way, we don't have to include it at all if we don't want, but the idea of consultation and meaningful engagement has been really important. In Canada, there are specific requirements for consultation of Indigenous communities when working on their land, but we don't have that provision in the US. And the provision in Canada is seriously flawed in many ways, even though it is a good starting point. So participants in the last several years have said to include, you know, a call for consultation and engagement in these policy recommendations. Do you all feel like that's an important thing to include this year? Or do you think that we've maybe outgrown that, or there's a different way to say it?
Katie, this is Ajayan. I'm not on video, I'm just voice. I think that's a really important point, and I know that there is a bit of a difference between Canada policy and the United States, but I think we can start using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the article on free, prior, and informed consent, which is essentially requiring that all governments and corporations that are, you know, kind of industry that is managed by government or overseen by government should consult and receive consent from Indigenous peoples before they do anything over their lands. And the reason why I think that we should start including that, it's because the United States under the Obama administration said that the UN Declaration was a policy that we recognize. So it's a little bit of legal maneuvering here, but we have essentially observed that this is an important policy that our nation recognizes. And so just to, you know, to say, in the US, we do observe the UN Declaration. The United States has been a signatory to the declaration. And under this declaration, we should have FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to deployment over Indigenous lands. And I think the reason why this is also really critical to point out, it's because in the United States, we have a competition-based industry and regulatory reality. That means that if you're able to compete in the market, then you'll get the funding or you will get service. And so we don't prevent Indigenous communities and tribal governments from joining competition, but we know that the reality of competition is that it makes it prohibitive for most tribal governments to build their own networks. So we have to rely on, I feel like we have to make sure that because we are in this competition environment, we're also saying that, well, for those who are competing, you must consult with Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. I'm really glad that you brought that up. That's a great point. And I think something we could easily point to in this document is to sort of reinforce what we're already saying. I really like that. Thanks, AJL.
I think it's also important that it is stronger language too. I think like for Canada, it's the duty to consult, which is very Canadian of us. It's, you know, like, oh, what do you think? Oh, I think it's a horrible idea. Cool, we're still doing it anyway. Like, it's not really policeable. It's not really tied to something, and tying it to something like the UN or other international things. It's an excellent way to do it. But also to make sure that like consent is definitely something that is stronger and more universal than consultation, right? Like, so I think it's, you know, maybe we're just trying to get something in, and it's good that we have something, but policing it really comes down to policing it or not. The other thing I was thinking is, and not really as a policy, but maybe as a strategy, is that there's a separation of models, right? I know that the telecom companies are going to fight, but maybe we say there's two models. You know, we're advocating for a model outside of the urban areas, right? Where this is, you know, if we were going to focus on something, separate, so we don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. We're not fighting for one way or another way. We're saying that the commercial focused way may work in an urban setting, and that's fine, but this model doesn't work outside of an urban area, right? So if we're looking at Indigenous communities, or we're looking for remote or very rural places, there'd be a different way of looking at it. So not involving the commercial aspect into things, being able to allow for more community-based things. And if it's separate, the reason I'm thinking it's separate is that maybe it's just too little to fight over. They can let this happen as far as resistance from telecommunications, right? That if you're going to get some of these policy changes through, start with the small communities and start with areas that nobody's really fighting over anyway, and then work towards the center. If we're trying to change policy globally and it affects everything, urban and non, then we're fighting over a much bigger pie. More of a strategy than a policy.
Yeah, Joel, I can really take your point on that. I think one thing we'll want to be careful of here is that there are still and underconnected communities in urban areas as well, which by and large are minority communities and low-income communities. And so one of the groups we work with, NYC Mesh, has done a great job of connecting those communities in New York City, for example, where in a city of that size and of that wealth, there are close to 1 million people that still don't have access to the internet. And so I think that one of the things the Internet Society has emphasized, and that we've emphasized in these policy recommendations in the past, is that yes, there are a lot of areas that commercial service providers have connected and are doing a great job, or at least a fine job. But there are a lot of places that they're just not going, and communities can't wait for them to do that. They need to be empowered to do it themselves, or to sort of flip the table and say they should have the power to draw companies in, or they should have the power to set up, regulatory proposals such as for pole attachments and things like that. Communities should have the power to decide how those things happen to entice service providers. So totally take your point, and think that that's definitely worth a larger conversation.
Yeah, and I think that kind of ties back into ownership, right? It's a problem because of who owns the poles. It's a problem because of who decides who gets to play in these areas, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that this goes to as well, that was a policy recommendation, actually, for background on this also, so we produced the 2019 policy recommendations last year. They came out, I think, like the second week of February. We started really ramping up in March. We had this trip planned for the graduates of last year's training program to come to DC and to Ottawa to talk to policymakers about this directly. And then 5 days before they were coming, COVID hit and the world shut down. So we worked with our community to recreate these policy recommendations and create a COVID specific set of policy recommendations. And one of the things that was in there that's not in the 2019 ones is this call for training and access to intellectual resources as well as financial resources that I think would be good to have a conversation about. And what the last year's Advocate said essentially was that if federal money goes to an outside entity, that entity should employ and train the number of community members necessary to maintain a network. So for example, if you are in a community that's really difficult to reach and something goes wrong, you don't have to wait for a service provider who doesn't live in your area, isn't familiar with the terrain, doesn't know the community, to get their butts into town and fix the problem. They should have already trained somebody in the community to fix it themselves. And that keeps the knowledge, resources, and also some of the finances in the community itself. And again, sort of shifts it so that the power is with the community. But that was, that's a COVID recommendation. It's not a broad recommendation. And so I'm wondering if you all think that that's worth keeping, or if it should be tweaked or ditched or something else.
No, I think that's not just a COVID thing. That's if they are going to, under the current model anyway, when they get the money, telecoms, I mean, and they come in, they do it their way, and it is a recipe to bleed money out of the community. It's regardless if it's not a local ISP that's doing it, and they're not local people that are working there, and those people aren't shopping there and doing all that, then this money is leaving that community and won't come back. So I think that's a all the time problem, not just a COVID problem.
I'd like to suggest something that's been bouncing around a little bit, is that there should be basic planning grants, like education planning grants, for a community education process and development of a plan for digital inclusion.
Great idea, Chris. I really like that.
And they should be focused specifically on Indigenous communities. I mean, there can be others too, but I think that's one piece of it. But then I would say that a second recommendation that's very similar would be there should be a fund specifically focused on Indigenous communities for financing networks, and those planning grants could be a part of that.
Just to piggyback off of that as well, I don't know if any of you guys have read Decolonizing Wealth, but part of the thought process behind that book was, these grantors, right? And I'm always thinking, oh, the federal government, the state government, or whatever for grants, but really, I think some of these recommendations need to go right to corporate and service providers, and they just need to be very straightforward and simple, right? It should be minimal amount of like reporting requirements and things like that. It should be easy access funding, right? Not overly burdensome and hard to qualify for funding.
I completely agree with you on that one. And I used to work for an organization called Next Century Cities that Chris is also very, very familiar with. And one of the things that we heard all the time from our members who are mayors is that sometimes it would cost more just to hire the personnel to keep up with all the paperwork for a grant than that grant actually gave them in the first place, which totally defeats the purpose. So I completely agree with you. I think that's a great one to include. All right, so I think we're headed back into plenary in the next 5 minutes. I don't know the exact time that we're going in, and I don't want to open my Slack because I don't know what chats are floating around in there while I'm sharing my screen. But I think that we have a really solid start to this. And I don't know, I mean, do you guys feel like there are any big gaps in what we're saying at this point?
Nope.
I think they link back to each other and they're universal.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop share for just a second then and find out how much time we have left here. Okay, we have 4 minutes left. So I will keep sharing my screen then. And just while I have a captive audience, I'm curious. I mean, I think most of you all have been in the training sessions for the last 6 weeks now. I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on how it went. Anything interesting that you learned or wish you had learned more of, or general feedback? Not to put you on the spot.
Katie, I don't probably have anything to say about that, but if I could just comment a little bit, I apologize. I was driving, trying to take care of my daily stuff. But I think one of the things that we face within Indian country is the incumbents tend to regulate, are regulated based on what they're providing, the level of service they're providing, and they're self-reported. There seems to be a flaw, which we're starting to see nationwide. If we could reset those standards of actual what the delivery is, I think that would truly increase the incumbents having to use federal funds that only they're eligible for to be able to reinvest into tribal communities. That's, you know, the provisioning and the actual delivery, the speed delivery, and the oversubscription rate seems to be where they're making their profit, but they're doing it on the backs of the federal government.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And so, Gabriel, how would you word that? Because I want to make sure I'm saying that correctly. Is it something where you feel like the problem lies in the fact that they are self-reporting, or that they're getting funds for speeds they may not deliver, or the fact that it's going to incumbents in the first place and not to the community?
I think all of them, but I think to be politically correct, the right statement would be that we come up with a new funding structure that identifies what provisioning and oversubscription rate should be to provide the adequate services needed for a community. Where, you know, because if they don't, because one of their requirements through the FCC is they provide that they're able to serve so much households. They use RUS, or they use all those different funding. And one of them is they have to at least meet broadband speeds. And if it's cost prohibitive for them, they find workarounds. So we need to find a way that'll capture it, so the rural communities are getting the necessary connectivity that the person right off the highway where the backbone is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And actually, that reminds me too, one of the things that we have sort of tried to find the best way to say in the past is to talk about sort of the communities that are not going to be able to get broadband speeds at this point. Like, there are some communities, especially when we look in the Arctic, for example, that are going to be satellite dependent for the time being. We work with communities that are on islands in the Arctic Ocean, and it's just not possible to go through the permafrost there to lay fiber at this point. And so figuring out how to set that bar for a community whose best hope for the time being is satellite would be something that I'm really curious to talk about. And we'll talk about that a ton over the next week as well. Like, how do you look at the speed metrics for communities that are so different? But I'd love your thoughts on that. Oh, and I guess we've got 1 minute to have this very big conversation.
Yeah, I think there's provisions for limited connectivity for the backhaul, and that's kind of where that falls. But just for the short time we have, I think it's important to start looking at all different ways and maybe increasing the satellite somehow to put more that way with drone technology and everything that's coming through. There's other possibilities out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I just want to point out for a second, Jane, I really appreciate your comment in the chat. It is so great to have you involved in this training and the community networks training. We're really excited to have this group here, and we are going to work really closely together over the course of this week and for the entire year to see how we can do this kind of work together. So this is the beginning, not the end. I'm glad to have you along.
Everyone, do we have everyone back from our separate breakout rooms? I believe we do. Awesome. Well, I hope you guys had as great of discussions as we did. We came up with a lot of really good ideas. And like I told, I noted in our breakout session, this isn't the end all be all. We're going to keep adding to these policy recommendations throughout the week as we hear more from our speakers and as we come up from new ideas based on the sessions throughout the week. So let's just use the last, we only have about 8 minutes, so it's not a ton of time. But if we can quickly just go through sort of really high level, briefly, what each breakout room came up with. So the room with Katie, did you guys want to go first and let us know just a few bullet points of what you came up with?
Can we go last? We've got a speaker for our group, but I'm sending her the notes right now.
Certainly. Anna, did you want to go ahead and do yours?
Sure thing. And you know what? I'm actually going to share my screen because if I can figure it out, because it's pretty good stuff, if that's all right. And I'll just run through this really quickly. So we put it into buckets of keep from last year, new, so things to add for this year, and then things to remove. So the obvious one to remove was the tribal priority window. That is because it's past and it's a little bit outdated, but a new one that we did include was to include a tribal priority window for every spectrum auction in the US. So we're still kind of, adapting it based on, what has happened in the past and what we would like to see in the future. We really thought that keeping, pretty much all of them from last year were really good ideas, but so things like, ensuring development funds are available to small and community-run ISPs, making sure that there are maybe some stronger and more specific parameters for community engagement, making sure that, when incumbents and providers are conducting community engagement, that, like we said in the ones from last year, it's not just like tick the box engagement, but it would be great if funding providers, whether that be like the FCC or the CRTC or ICED, that they can include specific parameters for what counts as community engagement. So these incumbents know exactly what they need to do to, create more meaningful engagement. It's really important to support local capacity building. This is really important because young people are really tech savvy. It's really important with COVID-19 because if we could limit the amount of outsiders who are coming in, that can just be, a good health precaution to take for these communities. And it's important given the history of how Indigenous people have been treated by the US and Canada. It's important to give them that idea that they can help their own communities. Some new things that we talked about was Heather had a great thought that it's important to require providers who acquire spectrum for communities, but they don't actually use it to give that spectrum to the covered communities. So that's just making sure that these providers aren't just getting spectrum and doing nothing about it. Kind of like what we said before, being really specific about the details of community consultations. Sasha talked about the importance of utilizing both local and federal policies to your advantage. Something that's really important for right now is to, Kyle, I don't know if you want to speak on this, on your experiences with this, but Kyle was talking about how it's so important to have formal processes for how you're going to deal with COVID-19.
Yes, this goes back to dealing with the community on a community by community basis. Some communities are more terrified of COVID than others, and so it's impossible to get us in there to finish our builds. It's important to address that first when you start engaging these communities to get anything started, is to have those insurances.
Mm-hmm. We discussed that. We discussed dig once. Dig once is really important. Which for those of you who don't know, dig once policies are the idea that if anyone is going in to dig up a road to do any kind of work on it, whether it's infrastructural or like pipes or electric wires, you just lay down some dark fiber in there while the road is dug up, because digging up the road is so much of the cost of deployment. We also discussed affordability. asking policymakers to create some kind of metric to judge how affordable the service will be. Because if you can, even get infrastructure to these communities, but they can't afford it, what's the point? I think that, we think that access is kind of two-pronged. It's both having the infrastructure and having the affordability. And then also making sure that it's high speed and it's good quality internet. Now with COVID-19, a lot of people are, even before COVID-19, people were living in multi-generational homes, but now everyone is at home using the internet all the time for work or school or whatever it may be, just connecting with people on a personal level. So it's important to have really good access. And that is what we talked about.
Great, thanks so much, Anna. We actually had a bit of overlap. As I guess you would expect, there's a lot of the same sort of basic ideas that we went over too. So since we only have a few minutes, I'm just going to really quickly go over some of the more high level stuff. You guys can see my screen okay, right? Awesome. So some of the more high level things we wanted to focus on were improving the broadband maps, because both in Canada and the US, it's been a really big problem for a long time. And I think this is something that we've touched on in last year's recommendations as well. Just the improved data needs to be there for any of the policy that we're recommending to work. That's kind of like a base level foundational sort of piece that we need to fit in for everything else to fall into place. So we'll flesh out the details of that throughout the week, but that's something that we definitely want to talk more about. We talked about including all stakeholders in access discussions. So this is sort of a overlap with community consultations. Myron Dewey, sorry to put you on the spot and call you out, but you had a lot of really good ideas and awesome insight and some stories into why community consultations are so important and how important it is to define these more narrowly and specifically so that projects are actually doing this and actually implementing these consultations properly before projects that could potentially negatively affect the communities that they are engaging with. Indigenous sovereignty is something that we also covered. That's a really important point that we're going to need to go into some finer details on, which we did get into, but I didn't take specific notes on that. So we'll kind of go in and flesh these out further throughout the week. We talked a lot about digital literacy, how important it is for communities to have the education and the training, similar to the trainings that we offered with the pre-summit ICS trainings, to give communities the chance to actually have the background that they need to understand the community consultations that they will hopefully be receiving. And then education and history, it's really important for people engaging with Indigenous communities to understand and be educated on the history of these sites, like sacred sites, for example, something that Myron also brought up. And we talked a little bit about key performance indicators and community networks such as mesh networks, or something that we really wanted to flesh out more. But we have about, well, we're actually on the last minute, but Katie, if you have anything to add to that.
Hey, I'll jump in here for Katie for the last couple of seconds. So we covered a lot of the same stuff that you guys did, especially focusing on access for education and funding. One of the key points that I thought that I didn't hear mentioned was having a separate model for or underconnected areas versus urban and connected areas. So obviously, clearly vast differences there. And then another thing that I thought was interesting was that we focused a lot on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and having free, prior, and informed consent. So we would like that to be included in the policies as well.
Great, thank you all so much. So I wish we had more time today because I know there's so many great ideas and there's so much more to talk about. But unfortunately, we're at the end of the session. So thank you all so much for coming. And I think this was noted before, but if you weren't able to attend any of the previous advocacy and policy training sessions, just email me or Anna or Katie, and we'll be sure to mark you as attended so you can get your certificate at the end of the summit, as this is the last training. So thank you all so much again. Thanks so much, Brandon, for all of your insight and your help leading the discussion. And thanks to everyone who brought up your great ideas. This was such an incredible session, as these always are with you all. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And we'll see you at the next session.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.
Sarah, you forgot one of the groups.
Oh no, Sally, did I?
Yeah, you did.
Oh my goodness.
I can send you our notes, I guess, if
Yes, please, of course, send me your notes.
okay, I will.
I thought we were only doing 3. That is my mistake.
No.
Well, Sarah,
Don't
do you
worry.
All right.
have a quick 30-second, 1-minute overview?
Yeah, we talked about dark fiber and how to access it, how to develop our own not-for-profit companies to go after the funding to build our own dark fiber networks. And we also talked about the price of bandwidth being based on a legacy old-fashioned model that's decades old, and doing our own research into what the price of bandwidth should actually be, and going after the accountants and legal teams for the telcos and explaining to them why the price of bandwidth model is outmoded. And Bert talked about digital equity. That was basically what we talked about.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sally. I don't know how I forgot your group, but I appreciate you bringing up those points, and we have noted them. And we will definitely, we're going to bring all these together and keep on adding onto them throughout the week and enhance them, and then make sure that we all have a look at them before the last day of the summit. And we all agree that they're great. And I look forward to everyone's input. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. And also stay here for the manners session. It's happening right now, if you're interested. With that, I think my colleague Andre is on.
Hello, everyone.
Hey there. All right, Andre, I'm going to make you co-host real quick. Oh, you may already be co-host. All right, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Andre. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, so in this session, we'll be talking about inter-domain routing, and I would like to start with a quick overview and a problem statement. What's wrong with the internet routing system and the internet, and then discuss why it's so hard to fix it, and present you an approach that is being supported by the Internet Society, aimed at sort of motivating or facilitating some of the fixes for the routing system. And hopefully I can motivate some of you who are network operators, and I understand there are quite a few network operators in this room, to consider joining this effort and shouldering this effort and helping improving routing security of the internet. So I don't see the chat because I'm sharing full screen. So if someone can monitor the chat, and if there are questions, I think there is no need to wait towards the end, because there are different sections, we'll cover different facets of the problem and solution. So please raise your hand and we can discuss some of the stuff as we go. All right. Well, again, this is, I think many of you have technical background and understand how routing system works. But just to give you an idea, there are about 70,000 independent networks operating on the internet. They're called in inter-domain routing as autonomous systems. They all exchange reachability information between themselves, right? And For instance, I know who my customers are, and I communicate this to my neighbor networks, and they pass this information along. And by doing this, after a while, the whole internet learns about various routes and builds a roadmap. Now, it's important to note here that the roadmap, each network builds its own, and it's slightly different for each of the network. But in general, it's coherent and it works. Unfortunately, the BGP, that's the routing protocol that is used to exchange this reachability information, is entirely based on trust. There is no built-in mechanism in this protocol that allows you to verify that what you're telling to your neighbors is true. That either you learn this from other networks, or those are your directly connected customers or networks. So because of lack of this built-in security in the BGP, it's possible to lie. I, for instance, can say that I'm a transit provider of YouTube, and some networks may believe me and therefore forward the traffic directed to YouTube to me. It's another question what I'm going to do with this traffic, but that's the problem, right? And because BGP doesn't have this mechanism built in, network operators who want to validate this information have to retreat to other out-of-band sources, such as routing information databases or repositories. We'll talk a bit about those. Now, routing incidents, they happen across the internet. I'll show you a picture, a few slides after, where you will see that every day there are several incidents happening in the internet. Last year alone, we counted some statistics. About 10,000 routing outages of attacks happened, and about 4% of all autonomous systems on the internet were affected. Now, routing security attacks or incidents are hard to detect sometimes, and it may manifest itself in loss of connectivity, in performance degradation, but for many of those things, routing is the actual problem. And the thing is that while they may happen to any size of the network, and they propagate very quickly and sometimes quite globally, affecting a significant part of the internet. So that's the graph I mentioned to you. So you can see there's about half of the year of this year, 2020, and you can see that every day something is happening. Now, those are possible BGP hijacks because the tool and data we're using to collect this data, it has some false positives. It's, first of all, hard to say whether it's an attack, whether it's a malicious intent, or is it just what we call fat fingers, misconfiguration. And secondly, some of those suspicious events, let me put it that way, they might in fact be legitimate configurations. But there are a few of them that are legitimate. Most of them are configuration mistakes, and a few of them are malicious attacks. So, well, I was talking about routing incidents, but maybe would be good to say a few words about what are those incidents. So this is a summary table, and what we understand by routing incidents broadly are two types. First is route hijacking or prefix hijacking, when network operator or attacker impersonates another network. When I'm saying I'm Google or I'm YouTube, and therefore, if networks believe me, they will send traffic directed to YouTube or Google to my network. Another more subtle misconfiguration or attack is called route leak. And I will show you a diagram, but that's basically a violation of the policy. It's when your customer network becomes a transit provider for you. And for instance, it transits traffic to big sites like Amazon or Google or Verizon, for instance. And what is also included here, which is not specifically related to BGP and routing, is source IP address spoofing. And why it's included here, first of all, it's a source of reflection amplification attacks. And as you know, those attacks are massive. It's so easy to mount those attacks, and disconnect between the cost to mount the attack and the damage they produce is enormous. But secondly, they exploit one of the features of the routing system, that is for routing packets. No one looks at the source IP address. It's like a postal system, right? You lose the destination address to pass the mail to its destination. Only if something happens, you need to look at the source IP address and respond back. So this is included because it's also related somehow to routing, and it is a big security hole. Now, let me spend some time talking about this routing incident in slightly more detail. I will not go into very big detail, but if there is interest, we can come back and discuss that. So I mentioned route hijacking, and here's a classic example of what happened in 2008 when Pakistan Telecom, well, admittedly, not maliciously, but as a configuration mistake, hijacked YouTube, right? And what happened is that their upstream provider believed them and spread this information across the whole internet. At least half of the internet believed this information. There was an outage of YouTube for about 2 hours. So in this particular diagram, you can see that this red network, it announces the prefix that belongs to YouTube, in fact, and this black IS 64500 believes them and spreads this information further. Now, in red circles, I pointed the networks that are affected by this incident. So you see this one culprit, it affected in this simple diagram at least 3 networks. And that happens due to lack of controls. And lack of controls are a substitute, well, the controls you need to substitute for the lack of security in BGP. Another type of incident that I also mentioned is route leak. So in this particular case, this network 64501, it learns about a route to Google from their transit provider B. And it communicates this information to another transit provider, IS 64500. So if IS 64500 believes this multi-home customer, the usual policy is to prefer routes you learn from your customer. And therefore, traffic to Google, this IS will forward to their customer. So you can imagine what happens. And that happened many, many times. Usually it ends very badly. It ends with an outage to this multi-home customer, to the transit provider, and to the service that is affected, in this case, Google. Again, in red circles, I circled networks that are affected by this incident. Now, those are major things, but this, for instance, route leak attack can happen in a much more subtle way. If you're interested in a particular flow, for instance, from customers to the bank, and you want to perform reconnaissance activities and not being spotted, you can leak a very small prefix with a limited amount of traffic, so no one will really notice this. And that will give you opportunity to look at what kind of traffic, what kind of ports are being connected, great reconnaissance activities. Otherwise, you would have to do active scanning, which will be probably detected. So routing incidents of this type are a perfect way to mount any man-in-the-middle attack, and that can be done in a very subtle way. And finally, source IP address spoofing. As I said, it's a root cause for reflection amplification attacks. And the thing is, it usually uses so-called reflectors. And one of the most popular reflectors is an open DNS resolver. So when an attacker is sending small questions to the DNS resolver with a spoofed source IP address pointing at victim, the resolver replies usually with a much bigger answer, and they all directed to one victim. So you see this amplification and also concentration of traffic, which usually creates a huge volumetric attack that damages the infrastructure. So let me pause here for a second. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat or any comments there, and see if you have any questions so far. Okay, let's move on then. So, okay, well, this problem, in fact, it's known for more than 2 decades. I think basically as soon as BGP was introduced, this flaw in BGP was known. And I think pretty much quite soon it was exploited, maybe not at scale as it happens now, but still. So why is routing security so hard? Now, each player, each of those 70,000 networks operating on the internet, they can contribute to routing security. But at the same time, they can be cause of a routing incident. They can be a weakest link in this chain of security. Now, most of the networks, of course, they would like to have more secure routing system, but because routing incidents are hard to debug and hard to fix. But in a way, they have very little incentive. The reason is, if you introduce those controls that I was talking about, you are not protecting your own network. You're improving routing security for the whole system just a little bit. And in fact, you're protecting other networks, your competitors. And put it other way around, security of your network from a routing perspective is in the hands of other networks. So for instance, I mentioned this routing incident which affected YouTube, where Pakistan Telecom hijacked YouTube prefix. Now, YouTube could have done only very little. Well, there's some little techniques you can play with, but generally speaking, no. They were just sitting and waiting while other operators would prefer this false route and prefer route from YouTube. So in fact, YouTube could do only so very little to protect themselves. They have to rely on other operators to do their job. So what this is called in social science a collective action problem, where while each of the players understand that, yes, we need to move in this direction because of the conflicting interest and lack of business case, nothing really happens. Now, it was suggested several times that problems like this can be solved with regulation, and maybe governments need to step in and dictate something that will make routing security controls, for instance, mandatory, or deployment of certain protocols mandatory. But in a global system and distributed system as the internet, those attempts are not effective and maybe futile, because even if you demand this from all the networks in one particular country, there might be another country that doesn't do this, and that network can really cause this incident. As we saw that a network in Pakistan can affect a network in the United States and vice versa. So it's really global. And unless you partition the internet itself, you cannot really solve this problem. So that asks for a solution on a global scale. Now, there is some light here. And it was shown that normative behaviors, can provide a solution in some of those cases. There is a need to agree on values and need to agree on behaviors. So if we sort of project this to the internet routing system, we can see that there is no disagreement about the common value. I think resilient and secure global routing system is in the interest of majority of network operators. Now, talking about behaviors, those are also pretty much codified in best practices, which existed for decades. Do not accept and propagate others' mistakes. Protect your neighbors from your own mistakes. I do not hijack, do not leak, and enable others to validate. So if you look at best practices in routing, these exist, even tools exist. All right. So what needs to happen is that we really need to move from this best practices and recommendations to norms, where not doing something becomes socially unacceptable. And as you know, network operators, it's a pretty social environment, right? So it's not a security, it's more a social problem that we need to solve. So we need to come up with something that can be used as a norm, which should be not a least common denominator, because then we have no effect, but it cannot be too high either. It cannot be just shooting for the sky. It cannot be best practice. It should be a good enough practice. And those norms should be visible and measurable, because we need to apply peer pressure, right? We need to understand who adheres to the norms and who doesn't. So here we come to this effort, which is called Mutually Agreed Norms for Routing Security, or abbreviated as MANAS. And this is this interplay that networks that do their clean up their side of the street, they have good manners. And this effort exactly build on those concepts that I presented to you just now. So MANAS, first of all, provides these baseline recommendations in the form of actions. So these recommendations, the idea is that we're promoting them as a norm. Now, they're not just recommendations and not called actions for nothing, because if you want to join MANAS, if you want to become part of this community, you need to demonstrate that you implemented those actions in your network. And there are some checks and balances in place. We do the audit before we admit a new network to this community. And I mentioned community. That's very important, because recommendations and slides alone will not solve the problem. It's a security-minded operators that form this social acceptance, right? This norm, support this norm, that really make the difference. All right, well, let me talk about MANAS programs, because there are different types of network operators if you look at the internet, and they have different sort of, we can leverage different qualities of those operators to promote routing security further. So we launched one by one. It didn't happen at once, but we launched one by one 3 programs. We start first with network operators. Then we looked and invited internet exchange points. And finally, we launched the program for content delivery networks and cloud providers. Let me talk about this in more detail. Probably too fast. So we start with network operators, and that started, what, 6 years ago? 9 operators came together and looked at what sort of baseline we can produce that would be acceptable, non-disputed, and can be easily met, those requirements, by majority of network operators. So that's how this first set of actions were born, with this rationale, right? We need to raise awareness, we need to promote this culture, demonstrate the ability of the industry to solve the problems by themselves, and provide a framework for operators to better understand how to move towards a more secure routing system. On that last point, I want to mention that if you look at security, consider security in corporate context, security is not a state, it's a process, right? So it's very important that you have a security framework deployed, that not cherry picking some security patches, but you have a consistent approach so you know what level of security you are achieving. Now, in the internet, with 70,000 independent networks, it's very difficult to create a systemic approach. So MANAS, as a framework, it can help doing this. It can provide global reference to disjoint communities and sort of geographically dispersed network operators that can relate to one single anchor and one community that works towards this solution. So here are 4 actions that are now active for network operators. And the network operator is any network that can speak BGP and passes traffic from one place to another, and has an autonomous system, of course. So actions in blue, those actions are mandatory, and action in white, which is anti-spoofing, is optional. We encourage operators to complete this action, but with understanding that not all network operators physically able to implement this. For instance, for transit providers, it's very difficult to implement anti-spoofing, effective anti-spoofing measures. It's much easier to implement those measures for access networks, for instance. That's why it's optional. So, well, as I mentioned, basically these actions, they describe those norms that we just discussed. So filtering, prevent propagation of incorrect routing information, and that is clean up your side of the street. Do not propagate and verify correctness of your own announcements, have controls in place, and announcements from your customers. And those are networks that you should be aware of. You should know what kind of prefixes your customers are emitting or supposed to emit, and you should know your own network as well. And we spoke a little bit about anti-spoofing, and there are some controls that allow you to prevent traffic with spoofed source IP addresses to leaving your network. Coordination, it seems like a very simple action. In fact, what it requires that you have a publicly known contact information, that you are reachable and you are responsive. But this simple action, it helps solve such a lot number of routing incidents and incidents of any type that it's very hard to overestimate its importance. And finally, global validation. The title is slightly misleading. It's done for the shortness, but in fact, what it says is facilitate global validation. Because in order to validate, and that's where we start, you need to look up, a network operator needs to look up in some other databases. This information is not available in the BGP, in this protocol itself, so you need to look up in other databases. There are two main types of those databases that exist. One is called Internet Routing Registry, and the types of it in North America, for instance, RADB is the most known. Erin also run their routing registry. And another type of routing information repository is RPKI. It's Resource PKI system. Both of them, they serve only one purpose. They publish information that allows you to check that which prefixes a particular network is allowed or is intended to announce. And RPKI is a digitally signed system. It's more secure, but IR also contains a lot of information, and it's more widely being deployed, although RPKI is taking off. Now it jumps. So after we launched the program for network operators, we're looking how to scale up, because that's very important. You start with 9 operators, and there's 70,000 networks that, in principle, you would like to get along. You want them to implement those measures. So how you bridge this gap from 9 to 70,000? And the answer is we need partners. We need other entities that can help promote routing security on their own, that can help scaling up this effort. And internet exchange points, they immediately came to mind because they have their local communities. And while there is no such thing as a global community, it's a sum of local communities. And that local communities where operators have common operational objective, right? Exchange traffic. And they have this eye contact, which is very important. So IXPs, they have these operational communities as their members. They're very interested of creating a secure peering environment, because routing incidents for internet exchange points, they caused, and they continue to cause, quite a lot of problems. If incorrect routing announcement can overwhelm the peering fabric and create an outage at the IXP. So IXP itself and all the members are interested in creating this environment and making this environment more secure. So it seemed like a win-win situation, but it took 2 years to develop this program, mainly because we need to reach consensus. We need to really come up with actions that are effective, that make a difference, that are not disputed, that everyone can agree that that's a good thing, and still not very high, that many IXPs can join. We launched this program in 2018 in March, and this program came with 5 actions, which some of them are similar to the 4 actions I showed you, but some of them they have reflect on the specifics of internet exchange points. Well, the first action is very similar, but that action 1 is really what creates a secure peering environment at the internet exchange point, because many internet exchange points that run this kind of proxy network, which is called a route server, which enables multilateral peering. So if you have a lot of members at your internet exchange point, in order to start exchanging traffic, you need to create peering arrangements with each of them. So that's a great big deal of network connections you need to arrange. Now with multilateral peering, you can just peer with this route server, and the route server will act as a proxy for you and will peer with all other members of the internet exchange. Now this route server is an excellent place to apply routing security controls. And the action 1 is exactly what it asks an internet exchange point to deploy. Now, action 2 is more of social nature, right? It says, well, in order to scale up, we need IXPs on board as ambassadors of this program so they can promote this program among their membership. And while there are different sizes of internet exchange points, from 10 members to several hundred members, but it's where scalability kicks in. And action 3, 4, 5 will not stop a long time. They're specific to internet exchanges, like protecting the peering platform, providing monitoring, debugging tools to the members. But also you see action 4, which is again about communication, about keeping communication lines open and being responsive. And action 1 and 2, again in blue, which means that they are mandatory, and 3 REST actions are optional. Now, once we launched that, we looked at other partners, and they're edge networks, but very important edge networks. Some of them are very big, some of them as big and global as probably big transit providers or even bigger. What I'm talking about is content delivery networks and cloud providers. So we create a task force with some of the members of this community, and put ahead of us a task to develop a similar set of actions that will leverage the peering power of those entities. Now, everyone wants to peer with CDN or with the cloud to improve performance of their services for their clients. Can we leverage this peering power to promote routing security? Can we leverage this peering power to promote better routing hygiene and motivate deployment of controls of the networks that are willing to connect or willing to peer with CDN in the cloud? So again, it's kind of similar to IXPs, but it's very specific because there is no community as such. There is no center. There is no proxy network. It's just one edge network that everyone wants to peer with. You see the action set grows as we go, is from program to program. Now we ended up with 6 actions. 5 of them are mandatory. And again, you see a lot of similarities, but you can also notice some of the specifics that reflect on the power and sort of, the attractiveness of CDN and cloud providers in a way they can promote routing security. So action one, and what is important is not the title, but what is written in black, is that what this action requires, that they do not only ensure correctness of their own announcements as an edge network, but they also ensure that networks they peer with, they do not accept incorrect announcements. So they enforce a filtering policy that in its turn enforce or motivates their peers to keep their announcements in order, not to emit incorrect routing announcements, or at least register those announcements in those routing repositories if they're valid. So CDNs and clouds can validate. And again, you see source IP spoofing, you can see an action on communication, you can see an action to facilitate validation of routing information on a global scale. And CDNs and cloud providers actually can do a lot in motivating that action for is implement not only by them, but also by their peers. And then action 5, encourage managed adoption. And that takes in different forms. For instance, it's not prescriptive, but we discuss different ways of doing this, and that can come with a peering template. It can be manners can be mentioned by in the peering portal that some of the CDNs are using to establish those peerings, and some other ways. Now, I mentioned this, and I realized I forgot to mention that manners in general, those actions are focusing on the outcomes. They do not prescribe a particular way of achieving this outcome. For this, we have those best practices and tools, but it focuses on what we want to achieve. And this is, so in a way, you can see manners as technology neutral platform. Even if we mention IR and RPKI, we're not entering into this debate what is best and what is secondary. We're saying, or either you register there or you register there following your operational practices. Now I started talking about increasing adoption of manners, and let me show you some graphs. So that's where we started with 9 operators. Now we're almost 500 network operators, almost 60 internet exchange points, and we just started, and we are 12 strong CDN and cloud providers. So you can see there was quite a slow start. We spent some time building awareness, but when more and more networks became aware of manners, I think you can see this nice curve going up to the right. That gives us hope that we can actually bridge this gap. And well, we probably don't need to get all 70,000 networks to manners. As you probably know, about 84% of all networks on the internet are edge networks. They're just edge single-homed networks, not single-home, but edge networks that do not have any customers besides themselves. So routing decisions are made by the 16% of all networks on the internet, and these networks we are trying to attract. The effort is really global, with some noticeable countries like US, because US is also a big country. It's a lot of networks operating there, but also Brazil. That's an interesting story here. And this is due to a project that Brazilian NIC started in the country called Secure Internet. Brazil has been notorious for routing incidents and lack of routing hygiene. So NIC.br, which is a network coordination center and also a DNS registry for .br, they started this project called Secure Internet, where they went from region to region promoting routing security practices and inviting people to join manners once they implemented those actions. And that created influx, very positive influx of application to the manners effort. That's why we have so many Brazilian members in manners. but that also improved routing security. There are much fewer incidents in Brazil over 3 years that this security program was working. Now, this is speculative, so I love this slide, but I specifically titled this "Impact of Efforts Like Menace on Routing Security." We cannot prove that efforts like Menace really caused reduction of routing incidents, but I like this sort of, there is some correlation, obviously. We see increase in Menace participants, and we see steady decrease in routing incidents. But what I can say for sure that, and again, I don't manage to take all the credits for this, but in the past 3 to 4 years, there was a significant increased awareness about routing security and routing incidents. So I think that led obviously to more sort of awareness and conscious approach by network operators, more careful operation, deployment of those routing security controls. And we hope that Menace contributed to this very positive trend as well. Now let me pause here because I finished talking about the effort, and I would like to show you some tools that we're using in making the effort more transparent, but also to help operators to clean up their yard and bring their network up to scratch. But let me pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat. No? Okay.
There is a question in the chat from Sally. So I repeat, it's does the frequency of the placement of IXPs increase the security along the routing path? The IXP acts like a speed bump.
Frequency and placement of IXPs. Well, so let me put it that way. I mentioned that there are 70,000 networks operating, and each of those networks can be a culprit, can cause a routing incident. But the more networks implement routing security controls, the more prevention for propagation of these routing incidents happen. It's like virus. I mean, it's an obvious analogy here. The more networks that are immune, and in this particular case, that can protect, that can stop this infection or false announcement to propagate, the smaller the scope of routing incident and the smaller the impact. Now, internet exchange points, they can do, they really a speed bump in this case because they secure a crossroads of maybe 10 or maybe several hundred of networks, right? Several hundred of crossroads that they can secure with just one go. So I guess to answer your question, I would say, yes, the more IXPs implement those measures, the more secure environment we get, because the more protection we get, the less propagation we see, and therefore the less impact on those routing incidents. Just a follow-up, there is another thing talking about the IXPs. So many of those incidents are really misconfigurations, because it's very easy to misconfigure something and that error will spread very quickly. But it's known that there's some fly-by spammers, for instance, that use very local environment like internet exchange point. They will appear there, they will inject this false announcement. This false announcement will not be seen globally because that's the way the internet exchange point operates, but at the same time will damage the members of the internet exchange. So for instance, they would hijack IP address space, which is not blacklisted yet, will spam from this address space. This address space becomes toxic and they disappear, but they've done their job and they damaged a big deal of members of an internet exchange point. Now, for internet exchange point, of course, there is an extra incentive to implement menace measures because that will prevent such incidents from happening. I hope that answers your question. Okay, if there are no more questions, let me continue with Manners Observatory, and we can discuss other stuff when at the end of the presentation. So 2 years ago, 1 year and a half, we launched a tool which we called Manners Observatory. And the motivation was that for Manners effort to be credible and really aspire to become a norm in routing operations, it needs to be transparent. At the moment, we are not there yet, by the way. And at the moment, if you look at the Manners website, you see a table with network operators and some of sort of ticks, what kind of actions they implement. And for a third party, that might look as self-declared conformance, which is not the case. As I told you, when the network joins Manners, we do the audit. To the best of our abilities, we don't do on-site audit. We do this from the outside, and there are some things that you unfortunately cannot see from the outside, but still to the best of our ability, we check that what the network claims they implement is indeed visible from the outside. But on the website, that's not visible. So our intention is to create a tool and ultimately publicly expose level of conformance of Manners participants. So you can see that these networks are really doing well, and maybe some of the networks need to put an extra effort to make their network really secure. So that was the motivation for the Manners Observatory. Another motivation, which is we have accomplished, that we need a tool to do the audit in a more consistent and more automated manner. And we're using Manners Observatory ourselves as a tool on a day-to-day evaluation of application that we receive from potential Manners members. We create a measurement framework, and the requirements for this measurement framework was it should be transparent. So it should use publicly accessible data. So there's no question why you decide that I'm non-compliant. It's all in principle traceable to original source, and anyone can perform the same measurements. It should be passive, because we want to measure any network without necessarily cooperation from this network. And we want to measure, in fact, all networks on the internet, all 70,000. It has to be passive. And it has to be evolving. So Manners community has the final say and can decide what should be measured and what not. What is the criteria for conformance and what's not. So launched last year in August, so slightly more than 1 year. We use trusted, publicly available third-party data. We do not do measurements ourselves, but we ingest this data and we calculate the metrics based on the framework that we created. So anyone can view aggregated data, and what we call aggregated, that's per region, per country. But in a public view, we are not showing data related to a particular network, because at this point, we are not at the stage where we want to Manners Observatory to become a finger-pointing tool. We want this to become a tool that supports our participants and helps them to improve. So Manners participants, so those who join the effort, they have access to detailed data about their own network, and they also have aggregated data about all networks of the participants of Manners. And the latter is needed to stimulate some peer pressure, where we can have discussion why some of the members are fully conformant and some of the participants are not so much. Now, as with any data, probably, there's some caveats, of course. There's some false positives. As I said, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between legitimate change in routing and an incident, to say nothing about attack. And also, lack of security controls is not always visible. For instance, we measure conformance on filtering as a absence of routing security incidents where a network was implicated in. But that's not, strictly speaking, true, because you might have been just lucky not having any routing incidents, but also not having any controls. To really ensure that controls are in place, what you need to do, you need to on-site audit. And this is at the moment well beyond our reach and our capabilities. So let me show you some screenshots. And well, this is a public face of the observatory. Anyone can go and look this up. If you scroll down, you will see the map. You can do this by geography. You can click on the country. You can see some statistics. You can see how countries are doing, for instance, right? And this landing page, it shows you a state of routing security. But routing security, and that's important note from Manus perspective. It shows routing security from the perspective of Manus conformers, which is not the same as just routing security in general. Because what we call by incidents, it is not necessarily routing incidents, it's incidents of non-conformance, right? There is a difference. They are related, and of course there are correlation, but really observatory is focusing on looking at routing through the prism of Manus conformance, Manus readiness, what we call it. And at the bottom, you can see numbers for, in this case, for APNIC region, on Manus readiness of all networks in this region. One can look at historical data. Well, in this particular case, there is a historical data for a particular network. So this data is only available for this network operator who operates this network, but that gives an operator an important insight how the network is evolving. Is security getting better? Is it not? What happened in one of the months, for instance? So that's a useful insight. And this is the table from, well, I implement those controls already. I don't see any reason to join Manus. And the message that it's a social act. It's an act of supporting the initiative on strengthening the Manus community. I think it needs some discussion, so it doesn't come naturally to some of the operators. Another thing is for some operators that might be a risk of getting negative publicity, because they joining Manus means commitment, means in a way public declaration of this commitment. So not all network operators are prepared to do this, and therefore in some circumstances being implicated of doing false commitments or doing false public announcements. For some operators, it also means capacity. It means that they are not up to scratch and they need to implement those controls. I mean, looking at how quickly routing incidents spread, it's pretty obvious that a majority of the network operators are still not implementing Manus actions. Because if those controls were in place, those incidents would have much more local scope. But that means, and especially for small networks that just started, for them, getting the operation up and running is very important. That's the highest priority. And unfortunately, as I said, because security is not built in, you can very quickly get network up and running, peer with your neighbors, and get the traffic going without caring, without implementing those security controls. So for them, and I will cover this a bit later, we have a special capacity building program to educate them and to lower the bar for them to be able to join Manus. So there are different causes also relate depending on the size of the network, its maturity level, and so on and so forth. Okay, well, I'm heading towards the end, and yes, I would like to show you a couple of slides on our training and capacity building. So yes, that's the case where you would like to join, but you're not ready because your network is not up to scratch and you don't have resources and knowledge perhaps to implement those actions. And the actions kind of scare you. Also because the Manus actions, as you read them, they're not implementation guide. As I said before, they focus on the outcomes. They do not prescribe how you implement this. So the first thing we did after we launched the first Manus program for network operators, we went off with the community and developed the Manus implementation guide, where we detailed what needs to be done to make your network Manus conformant or Manus ready. And then we went further and we create online course that walks you through. Basically, it's based on the implementation guide, but in an interactive way, it walks you through how to implement those actions. We also have a online virtual lab that allows people to configure the network as a Manus compliant network. So you have a clean slate network, and the task is please configure this network with those peers and those customers to be fully Manus ready. And we this lab we continue working with our training partners. So we want to promote this lab as a, for instance, and exam, a test module that some of them can use. Some of them can use this as a sort of test after the BGP security or network security course is complete. They can use this small module. It's a 1 or 2 hours lab that can easily be set up because it's virtual, but can allow also to promote Manus. Now, to finish up, I'd like to say that Manus is an important step. It's not the solution. Many things have to happen before we can declare our job done and routing system secure. Security is a process, not a state. So we need continuous, constant attention to those issues, right? And Manus is an ongoing effort. It actually stimulates this attention. It stimulates activity in the community as well. So we are on alert when something like this happens. It's a minimum that operators should consider. And I think more and more we see that in operation environment that becomes more a norm. And if you're not implementing this stuff, people might look at you. I think people are not ready yet to create maybe different attitude, like, well, I wouldn't peer with you unless you're a Manus member, or I would have a different peering policy if you're not a Manus member. But I think we're heading towards that, right? For instance, many of the IXPs, they put Manus logger next to their members that are part of the Manus initiative. And some of the IXPs that even allow you to create peerings based on the selection. I would like to peer only with Manus members. So more and more members join the initiative. I think that will become more common. And that will create additional business case also why you would like to join Manus, because you would like to signal your security posture to other members of networking community.
Elle est plus très fatiguée. Hein? Elle est plus très fatiguée. Ah, peut-être? Non, elle est comme ça.
So yeah, it's not a one-stop solution, right? The system is much more complex, and no one party, not one effort can solve that problem. It really requires what I put in the title, a concerted effort, right? But as we build critical mass, I think we're close to making a real impact, and I hope we're already making impact, in fact. So let me finish up with this, sort of trying to answer that question, why a network should consider joining Manus. Well, first of all, if you implement those controls, you improve your own security posture, right? You reduce number of and impact of routing incidents. For instance, you don't want your customer to become a transit to Google, right? For instance, that will ruin your business, that will create a huge outage, that will give you bad publicity. So that's certainly a clear reason to consider implementing this stuff. Well, as a sort of from a social perspective, I think it's important if you join Manus, you demonstrate that those practices, those best practices or good enough practices are reality, that operators indeed implement those practices that are not just paperwork, that you meet the expectations of the operators community. As I said, it more and more feels like a norm. So meeting the expectation becomes important, especially if you're not a newcomer. Join community of security-minded operators. Sometimes we have very interesting discussions on the mailing list, and we are stimulating this. We are stimulating self-governance structure, because while Internet Society is supporting Manus, we see Manus as a truly community effort. And of course, use Manus as a competitive differentiator. In security, and especially in distributed security, is very difficult. One difficult thing is how you signal your security posture. And that's why all the certification schemes are for, so we can consider Manus as a very soft and very low entry certification scheme. But still, as it gets more and more reputation in the networking community, I think the Manus badge becomes more important. So please join us. Joining is very easy. You go to the website, you click on join, and you need to fill out the form. Well, before you do this, ensure that you implement Manus actions, of course, because we'll check. And if you fill the form, please describe how the actions are implemented in as much detail as possible. That really simplifies the process of auditing for us and facilitates the whole process. And very important, please get involved in the community. I think this is our common responsibility. Routing security is a common problem requiring concerted solution, and that's where community is very important. And with this, let me stop at this slide because it contains some of the URLs and social media hashtags. Please use them if you tweet something that is Manus related. Here we are. I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.
Also, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute and just say them out loud.
So if you don't have immediate questions, but question comes to you later, you can reach us, the Manus team, at manus@isoc.org. You probably have my email address. It was on the first slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you're considering or you're not sure how to join Manus, or you have any other suggestions how to improve this effort, or any other thoughts. We really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. And I believe that is our last session for the day today. So thank you all for joining for our first day of the Indigenous Connectivity Summit. We're going to send out an email tomorrow morning with this Zoom link again, so you can find it pretty easily, so you can hop on tomorrow as well to join us for our program tomorrow. So if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to email any of us on staff. I'll drop my email right here. And then you can also reach Katie at jordan@isoc.com or Sarah at young@isoc.com. or at isoc.org, excuse me. But yeah, feel free to send us any questions and we will see you tomorrow. Katie, do you have any other notes?
Nope, I think you hit it.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Andre.